You've probably heard by now about Prolix-8. Prolix-8 is not to be confused with Frolix-8 of P.K. Dick fame. P.K. Dick was a publicist for certain alien races, and Frolix-8 was one of his clients. But even P.K. Dick was not as exuberant about his clientele as was Kurt Vonnegut with the Tralfamadorians. However, this is about neither Frolixians or Tralfamadorians. This is about Prolix and the fate that befell that planet. For you see, it all started out innocent enough. There was a courier firm that decided that they wanted to become more efficient, and they noticed that Proloxian congestion made it very difficult to make left-hand turns. Therefore, they decided that they would program their automated courier fleet to take only right-hand turns. That way, they expected to be able to map routes more efficiently and deliver more quickly, and therefore become more profitable. And they succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The company became extremely successful, so much so that other automated courier fleets followed suit. And before you knew it, they were also abolishing the left-hand turn to make only right-hand turns. That then filtered through to other types of fleets. So before you knew it, buses and taxis and even passenger cars over time all adopted this fully automated, self-driving, right-hand turn only approach to the roads, which worked wonderfully. Even pedestrians, when they wanted to cross a crosswalk, were no longer afraid of the left hook. They knew that they only had to look out from traffic turning from the right, and they'd be in the clear. It wasn't perfect. For example, they had to get rid of some of those left-hand exits off of highways, instead putting in those clover leaves where you could just kind of turn right at all points, regardless of what direction you ultimately needed to go in. So that more or less worked out. But as automation took over and insisted that all things go only to the right, it eventually became something that filtered its way through into the Proloxian culture. So before you knew it, at first, that direction other than right became sort of cliche. Then it fell entirely out of practice. And eventually it just wasn't done anymore. It wasn't even considered. So if you'd have someone talking to you from your right, your other right, you would turn 3/4 of a turn to the right. So you'd have your right and your other right. And so right or righter, and to face in a particular direction, it just meant how far to the right you would turn to go in that direction. They relaid out stores so that people would only take their carts and baskets to the right, and were able to put everything together so that pedestrian flows always went to the right. So that all more or less worked out. However, as the other direction fell out of favor, there were some complications. For example, popular dating apps. People forgot the alternative and were only able to swipe to the right. That resulted in some embarrassing situations where people ended up on dates that they didn't necessarily want to be on, which seemed like a pretty minor thing, but there you have it. It grew more serious when certain languages that required reading from right to the other direction fell out of the public knowledge and began to become forgotten. And in fact, it started to be difficult to turn pages backwards. Instead, if somebody wanted to refer back in a book, they had to go all the way to the end and then flip it over and flip it again, and then start over again to page left to right. So these sorts of inconveniences were bad, but things got really bad when that left turn amnesia began to strike, and people began to forget what it meant to go anti-clockwise. That had an effect in the factories where automation was now only doing one thing. It was screwing things in clockwise. It was connecting everything clockwise. And then if a mechanic wanted to undo something, they found themselves unable to figure out how to do it. Therefore, if, say, one of their Prolix-8 hovercraft had a blown alternator, you'd have to throw the whole thing out and order another one shipped from the factory using a courier that took only right-hand turns. So, as you can imagine, this began to lead to a general panic because there were many, many things that people had forgotten about that they were no longer able to do. You could not unscrew anything because that was no longer an existing option. The panicking Proloxians put their best and brightest on the case to figure out what might possibly be happening here. They knew they had some lost knowledge that they needed to get back. So they looked through the archives and they understood that there was this concept of this thing that wasn't right. And so they looked into the concept and wrote a lot of complex formulas and did physics, of course, writing left to right, and realized that this thing existed theoretically. And they even managed to conduct some experiments where they would take something and they would pull it in the opposite direction. They'd rotate it in that direction that wasn't right. And because of the collective amnesia of society, this was no longer something that they could see happening. It had fallen so far out of the public consciousness or the civil consciousness that all they knew was that they would turn a thing in a particular direction and it would disappear because they couldn't comprehend what was happening. And only when its rotation stopped or it began to rotate in the other direction would it then mysteriously reappear. To draw an analogy, it's a little bit like a tesseract or quantum physics with an electron field, where the electron has a particular way of moving where it disappears from one place and reappears in another. And you know that something happened to bring it from point A to point B, but you just don't know some sort of interdimensionality took place between those two. That's the unfortunate situation they were in. And as the sad case was, the Proloxians ultimately found themselves unable even to use things that turned in the direction other than clockwise, even for minor things. And the tragedy there was that refrigerators and freezers with right-hand hinges or doors with right-hand hinges, they found they were no longer able to open them because they opened in a direction that no longer existed or in a rotation that no longer existed. So in the end, the Proloxians were trapped in their own homes, unable to get out. Even if they could, they'd be unable to open the passenger car door, again, for lack of direction. And it did in the entire planet. No one survived. But in the end, nothing was left. Nothing was left at all. And it was only right. It was all right.